The lawyer's pen hovered over the divorce papers as my husband sat across from me, his face draining of color like water from a broken dam. "What do you mean she owns everything?" he whispered, and I almost smiled at how his voice cracked on the word everything, the way it used to crack when he was nervous during those early construction bids 32 years ago. After 3 decades of being told I was just the maid, he was about to learn exactly what this maid had been quietly acquiring while he thought I was dusting furniture and organizing his sock drawer. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though the beginning feels like a lifetime ago now, buried under layers of accumulated disappointment and carefully managed expectations. 32 years of marriage to Robert Eugene Garrett, and for most of those years, I genuinely believed we were partners in the truest sense of the word. I was Helen Morrison then, fresh out of college with a business degree I'd earned while working nights at a 24-hour diner on Route 9, scraping together tuition money one semester at a time, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt water, and studying accounting principles between orders of eggs over easy and apple pie. Robert was charming in that particular way that ambitious young men can be when they're hungry for success and convinced that the world owes them something magnificent. He was 26 to my 24, with calloused hands and big dreams, and a way of talking about the future that made it sound like a place we'd build together, brick by brick, foundation to roofline. When he proposed on a snowy February evening in 1991, kneeling in the parking lot of that same diner where I'd spent so many nights studying, he painted pictures of us, building an empire together, side by side, equal partners in love and business and life. "Helen Morrison, Hitsadzi," he said, the engagement ring trembling in his cold fingers. "Will you help me build something beautiful?" And God help me, I believed him. I believed in us, in the vision he painted of our shared future, in the idea that two people who loved each other could create something larger and more meaningful than what either could accomplish alone. I said yes with my whole heart, with every fiber of my 24-year-old optimism, never imagining that help me build something would eventually become stay home and keep house while I build something. Those early years, we did work together in ways that felt magical and purposeful and exactly like what I dreamed marriage could be. While Robert learned the trades and started taking on small jobs, bathroom renovations, deck installations, the occasional kitchen remodel, I kept the books, managed the finances, dealt with suppliers and permits and all the endless paperwork that keeps a small business from drowning in its own bureaucracy. I was good at it too, better than either of us had expected. I had an instinct for numbers and contracts that surprised even me, a way of seeing through the complexity of business deals to the essential questions that mattered. Can we do this work profitably? Do we have the cash flow to handle the timeline? What are the real risks, and how do we protect ourselves? When Robert landed his first big commercial job, a strip mall renovation that represented more money than we'd ever seen in one place, I was the one who structured the deal, negotiated the payment schedule, made sure we didn't get buried in change orders, and cost overruns and all the ways that inexperienced contractors get taken advantage of by developers who've been playing this game since before you were born. I spent weeks reading that contract, researching every clause, making sure we understood exactly what we were agreeing to do and when we'd get paid for doing it. The job was a success, our first real taste of what it felt like to run a legitimate business instead of just scraping by from paycheck to paycheck. Robert's work was excellent. He'd always had gifted hands and an eye for quality that set him apart from the corner-cutting contractors who gave the industry a bad reputation. But it was my financial management and contract negotiation that made sure we actually made money on the project instead of just staying busy. I remember the night we got the final payment, sitting at our tiny kitchen table in the apartment we rented above Mrs. Chen's Chinese restaurant, counting out more cash than we'd ever had at one time. Robert reached across the table and took my hands, his eyes bright with excitement and gratitude and something that looked like love but might have been relief. "We did it, Helen," he said. "We actually did it. We're going to be okay." And I believed him. I believed we were partners, that we meant both of us, that the success we'd earned together would always belong to both of us. But somewhere along the way, as the company grew and the money started flowing steadier and Robert's confidence in his own abilities hardened into something that looked more like arrogance, his memory of those early days began to fade like photographs left too long in sunlight. The transformation was so gradual, so subtle, that I almost didn't notice it happening. One day I was Helen, the business partner, and the next I was Helen, the contractor's wife, expected to smile and nod when people asked what I did for work, expected to find fulfillment in supporting someone else's dreams instead of pursuing my own. Robert started introducing me at business functions as the wife instead of his business partner, as if my contributions to our shared success had been so minor that they didn't warrant acknowledgement. Then he stopped taking me to business functions altogether, saying I'd be bored by all the construction talk, as if I hadn't spent years learning about foundation work and electrical codes and the complex dance of permits and inspections that governs every project. When I'd tried to discuss company matters at home, he'd wave me off with a patronizing smile that made me feel about 12 years old and not particularly bright. "Don't worry your pretty head about it, Helen," he'd say, already turning his attention back to whatever he'd been doing before I interrupted with my irrelevant questions. "I've got this handled." The dismissal was casual, automatic, delivered with the sort of absent-minded condescension that somehow hurt more than outright cruelty would have. At least cruelty would have acknowledged that my opinions mattered enough to reject. This was something worse. It was erasure, the gradual editing of my contributions out of our shared history until I became a supporting character in the story of Robert Garrett's success. I tried to adapt, to find ways to stay involved that didn't threaten his growing sense of himself as the sole architect of our prosperity. I volunteered to handle the bookkeeping from home, thinking that financial management was something I could do quietly, without challenging his need to be seen as the decision-maker. But even that became a source of tension as Robert grew more possessive of information about the business, more secretive about contracts and cash flow, and the details that would help me understand how we were really doing. "You don't need to worry about that stuff anymore, Hirigosio," he'd say when I asked about a particularly large invoice or tried to understand why our tax situation was getting more complicated each year. "I've got an accountant handling all that now. You've got enough to do keeping the house running." And so, gradually, inexorably, I found myself pushed out of the business we'd built together and into the domestic sphere that Robert seemed to think was my natural habitat. I was expected to have dinner ready when he walked through the door, expected to manage his social calendar and keep his house spotless, and smile prettily when his colleagues' wives made small talk about gardening and grandchildren and the latest sale at Nordstrom. The transformation was complete by our 10th wedding anniversary. I had become Helen the housewife, Helen the contractor's wife, Helen whose job was to make sure Robert's life ran smoothly so he could focus on the important work of building his empire. When people asked what I did, I learned to say I keep busy in the vague, slightly apologetic way that women of my generation were taught to deflect questions about our apparent lack of ambition. But what I didn't tell Robert, what I never told anyone, was that I had never really stopped being Helen Morrison, the young woman with a business degree and an eye for opportunity. While he thought I was content with my domestic duties, dutifully shopping for groceries and reorganizing closets and attending coffee mornings with other wives who seemed genuinely fulfilled by discussing the relative merits of different vacuum cleaners, I had quietly been building something of my own. It started small, almost, by accident with money I'd saved from those early business bookkeeping days, money Robert had never bothered to ask about because he'd assumed it was insignificant. $3,000, sitting in a savings account that received statements I collected from the mailbox before Robert came home from work. Not much money by the standards of the business we'd been building, but enough to make a down payment on a small rental property I'd spotted in a neighborhood that was just beginning to show signs of improvement. The house was a modest two-bedroom bungalow built in the 1940s with good bones but cosmetic issues that scared off most buyers. The kitchen was stuck in 1970 with avocado green appliances and countertops that looked like they'd been installed by someone with a grudge against both functionality and beauty. The bathroom needed everything. New fixtures, new flooring, new everything except the cast iron bathtub that was too heavy to move and too beautiful to replace. The living room had wood floors that were gorgeous under the stained carpet that covered them, and the whole place had the kind of solid construction that you don't find in newer homes. Most people saw problems when they looked at that house. I saw potential, and more importantly, I saw profit. The neighborhood was attracting young professionals who couldn't afford to live closer to downtown, but wanted something with more character than the suburban developments that were springing up on the other side of the city. Coffee shops were starting to appear, little galleries and bookstores, the kinds of businesses that signal a neighborhood in transition. I bought the house without telling Robert, using the money from our joint savings account that he never monitored because he assumed I was only spending it on household expenses and personal items. The purchase price was $28,000, which seemed enormous to me at the time, but was actually quite reasonable for a house with that much potential in a location that was positioned for growth. The renovation took 6 months of afternoons and weekends, time Robert thought I was spending volunteering at the hospital, or having lunch with friends, or doing whatever it was he imagined wives did with their abundant free time. In reality, I was learning about plumbing and electrical work and the mysterious alchemy of transforming an ugly space into something beautiful and functional. I hired contractors for the work that required expertise I didn't have, but I did most of the cosmetic improvements myself, stripping wallpaper and painting walls and refinishing those gorgeous hardwood floors until they gleamed like honey in the afternoon light. The first tenant was a young teacher named Monica, who worked at the elementary school 3 blocks away. She was delighted to find a place she could walk to work, charmed by the restored vintage fixtures and the little garden I'd planted in the backyard. The rent I charged her was enough to cover the mortgage payment, property taxes, and a small profit that I deposited into the same savings account where the renovation money had come from. That first rental income felt like magic, like I'd discovered a secret about how money could work for you instead of the other way around. Every month, Monica's rent check represented proof that I was capable of more than Robert seemed to think, that the business skills I'd developed during our early years together were still sharp and useful and valuable. I used the rental income to save for another property, and 6 months later I found one, a duplex in the same neighborhood, with 2 units that needed different levels of work. The upstairs apartment was move-in, ready except for cosmetic updates, while the downstairs unit needed significant renovation to make it habitable. I bought it with a combination of savings and a small business loan that I qualified for based on the income from my first rental property. Robert never noticed the loan payments because I had them automatically deducted from the account where I deposited the rental income, an account that received statements I collected and filed in a folder he never looked at because financial details were apparently my responsibility, as long as they didn't require any actual decision-making on his part. The duplex project taught me more about property management and renovation planning, about working with tenants and handling maintenance calls and all the practical skills that you can't learn from books or classes. I discovered that I was good at it, that I had an instinct for what renters wanted and what improvements would add the most value. I learned to spot the difference between cosmetic problems that looked expensive, but were actually easy fixes, and structural issues that could eat up all your profit if you weren't careful. By our 15th wedding anniversary, I owned 4 rental properties and was managing them out of a small office I rented in what had once been the town's industrial district and was becoming an area of small businesses and artists' studios. I told Robert I was volunteering at the hospital, which was technically true. I did volunteer there 1 morning a week, enough to make the story believable if anyone ever asked for details. The properties I chose were strategic, selected with the same care I'd once put into analyzing Robert's construction contracts. I preferred older homes with good bones in neighborhoods that showed signs of coming improvement. New coffee shops, young families moving in, small businesses opening up, the subtle indicators that property values were likely to rise over time. I had an eye for it, and more importantly, I had the patience to wait for the right opportunities and the discipline to do the research that separated good investments from expensive mistakes. While Robert was focused on the big, flashy projects that would make him look successful and feed his growing need for recognition and status, I was quietly acquiring assets that would appreciate steadily over time. He chased cash flow and impressive contracts, the kinds of work that generated immediate income but didn't necessarily build long-term wealth. I focused on properties that would be worth significantly more in 10 or 20 years than they cost today, investments that would continue generating income long after Robert's construction equipment was obsolete. The rental income was substantial by any reasonable measure, but I lived modestly, funneling most of the profits back into acquiring new properties or improving existing ones. Robert never noticed that I rarely asked him for spending money anymore, never questioned where I got the funds for the little luxuries I allowed myself. Nice clothes, regular spa visits, the occasional weekend trip to visit my sister in Portland. He was too busy building his own empire to pay attention to the details of how I spent my days or managed my personal expenses. In his mind, I was still the wife he'd married, content with domestic responsibilities and grateful for the comfortable life his hard work provided. The possibility that I might have my own ambitions, my own sources of income, my own professional identity, simply never occurred to him. He'd written me off as financially dependent and professionally irrelevant so thoroughly that he couldn't see evidence to the contrary even when it was right in front of him. By our 20th anniversary, I had become financially independent without him realizing it, and there was a certain satisfaction in that accomplishment that had nothing to do with the money itself. It was the quiet pride of having built something valuable with my own knowledge and judgment, the confidence that came from proving to myself that the business skills I'd developed weren't dependent on Robert's approval or recognition, but I didn't plan to use this independence to leave him. We had built a life together, even if he didn't always appreciate my contributions to it. We had children who loved both their parents, a home that represented decades of shared memories, a community of friends and neighbors who knew us as a couple. I thought we could continue as we were, each of us pursuing our own interests while maintaining the partnership that had sustained us through the challenges and changes of adult life. I was wrong about that as it turned out, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The house we lived in, the beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with its perfectly landscaped yard and renovated kitchen that had been featured in the local newspaper's home and garden section, wasn't owned by Robert Garrett, successful contractor. It was owned by Morrison Properties, LLC, which was owned entirely by Helen Morrison Garrett, successful real estate investor. I had purchased it from the original developer using my own funds and credit rating, then structured a lease agreement with Robert that he'd signed without reading, carefully, assuming it was just another piece of paperwork related to the mortgage he thought he was paying. For 22 years, Robert Garrett had been paying rent to his wife to live in what he believed was his own home, and the rental income had been one of the steady profit centers that allowed me to continue expanding my property portfolio. The irony was rich enough to taste, though I took no pleasure in it at the time. Robert felt magnanimous, allowing me to spend his money on groceries and household expenses, indulgent when he gave me a credit card for personal purchases, proud of his role as provider and protector of a wife who couldn't possibly manage on her own. He thought of himself as financially responsible, practical, generous with his hard-earned success, but the reality was that for over 2 decades, my business had been subsidizing his lifestyle in ways he never recognized. The rent he paid me for the house was well below market rate. I'd set it that way intentionally, wanting our living expenses to be manageable while still generating income from the property. He'd been living in a beautiful home for far less than he could have rented a comparable property anywhere else in the area, and the difference had allowed him to invest more money in his business, take bigger risks, maintain the lifestyle that made him feel successful and important. Meanwhile, several of his most valuable business assets, including the building that housed his company offices and the equipment yard where he stored his construction machinery, were actually owned by Morrison Properties, not by Robert Garrett Construction. I had purchased them years earlier when he needed to free up capital for a large commercial project, structuring the deals as lease-to-own arrangements that had never quite converted to outright ownership. He'd been paying me rent on his own business facilities for 8 years without realizing it, and those payments had helped finance my acquisition of additional rental properties in neighborhoods that were becoming increasingly desirable. By our 25th anniversary, I owned 11 rental properties outright and had a small but profitable property management business that I ran out of a downtown office Robert had never seen. My portfolio was worth just over $2 million, generating enough monthly income to support a comfortable lifestyle without touching the principal. I had achieved the kind of financial security that most people spend their entire careers trying to build, and I'd done it quietly, efficiently, without fanfare or recognition or any expectation that Robert would acknowledge my success. I wasn't hiding my accomplishments out of shame or fear. I was protecting them from the kind of casual dismissal that had gradually eroded my role in our marriage. I'd learned not to bring him good news about business successes or investment opportunities because his responses ranged from polite disinterest to active discouragement. When I'd mentioned considering a real estate license years earlier, he'd laughed and asked why I'd want to spend time showing houses to strangers when I had a perfectly good home of my own to take care of. So I'd stopped mentioning it. I'd stopped trying to share the satisfaction of a successful negotiation or the excitement of finding a property with exceptional potential. I'd learned to compartmentalize my life in ways that kept the peace, but left me feeling increasingly isolated from the person who was supposed to be my closest companion and strongest supporter. It might have continued that way indefinitely. I'd found a rhythm that worked, a way of managing both my domestic responsibilities and my business interests without creating conflict or challenging Robert's need to see himself as the primary breadwinner and decision-maker in our household. I was content enough with the arrangement, proud of what I'd built, and confident that I could continue building it, regardless of whether anyone else understood or appreciated what I was doing. Then came the day that changed everything, the moment when Robert's true feelings about our partnership were revealed in a way that couldn't be rationalized or explained away. Robert had invited some potential clients over for dinner, a married couple named Henderson who were considering hiring his company for a large residential development project. It was the kind of contract that could define the next phase of his career, the sort of high-profile, high-profit work that would establish him as one of the premier contractors in the region. He'd been courting this opportunity for months, meeting with architects and engineers and city planners, developing detailed proposals and cost estimates, doing everything he could to position himself as the obvious choice for the project. I understood the importance of the evening and was determined to make it perfect. I spent the entire afternoon preparing, making his favorite roast beef with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes, setting the table with our good china and crystal, arranging flowers from our garden in the centerpiece, making sure every detail reflected the kind of sophistication and attention to quality that would impress people who were considering investing millions of dollars in a construction project. The Hendersons arrived promptly at 7, and I could see immediately why Robert was so eager to work with them. Janet Henderson was an interior designer with her own firm, elegant and articulate with the kind of professional confidence that comes from years of success in a competitive field. Her husband Michael developed upscale residential communities, the kind of exclusive neighborhoods where houses started at $500,000 and buyers expected everything to be absolutely perfect. The evening started well enough. They complimented the house, the meal, the wine Robert had selected from our small but carefully chosen collection. They asked polite questions about how long we'd lived in the area, what we liked about the neighborhood, the kinds of conversational warm-up that precedes serious business discussions. Robert was in his element, telling stories about various projects, dropping names of other clients, painting himself as the kind of contractor who could handle sophisticated, high-end work without breaking a sweat. I played my expected role, making sure glasses stayed filled and plates never sat empty, contributing just enough to the conversation to be gracious, without drawing attention away from Robert's carefully orchestrated presentation of his capabilities and experience. It was a performance I'd given many times over the years, the supporting role of the successful contractor's wife, charming and competent and completely unthreatening to the men who were making the real decisions. But then Janet Henderson started asking me questions that went beyond polite small talk, questions that suggested genuine interest in me as an individual rather than just as Robert's spouse. She asked about my background, whether I'd ever worked in the construction industry, how I'd learned to manage the beautiful renovations she'd noticed throughout our home. She was looking at me with the kind of professional attention that I hadn't experienced in years, as if she recognized something in me that deserved acknowledgement and respect. I could see Robert getting uncomfortable with the attention shifting to me, could feel his growing irritation at having his carefully planned evening disrupted by questions that weren't about his work or his expertise. But Janet's interest seemed genuine, and it had been so long since anyone had asked me about my own knowledge and experience that I found myself answering her questions honestly. I told her about my business degree, about the early days when I'd helped Robert structure contracts and manage the financial side of his growing company. I mentioned my interest in real estate, the satisfaction I found in seeing potential in properties that other people overlooked. I was careful not to go into too much detail, not to say anything that would embarrass Robert or suggest that I had professional ambitions that competed with his, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to be seen as someone with relevant knowledge and experience. "Oh, so you're really a partner in the business then," Janet said with genuine warmth and interest. "How wonderful that you've been able to work together all these years. So many couples struggle with that kind of collaboration, but it sounds like you've found a way to make it work beautifully." And that's when Robert laughed. Not a warm laugh, not an affectionate chuckle acknowledging the partnership Janet had recognized, but a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the dinner conversation like a blade through silk. The sound was so unexpected, so jarring in the context of what had been a pleasant social evening, that conversation stopped completely. Janet's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, embarrassment, something that might have been anger on my behalf. "Partner? Oh no. Helen hasn't been involved in the business for years," Robert said, his voice carrying the kind of casual dismissiveness that suggested the very idea was mildly amusing. "She's just the maid around here now." The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of absolute quiet that makes you acutely aware of the sound of your own breathing and the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Janet's face had gone very still, her professional composure intact, but her eyes flashing with something that looked like barely controlled anger. Michael cleared his throat and tried to change the subject, asking Robert about his equipment inventory, but the damage was done. The easy warmth of the evening had been replaced by something cold and uncomfortable, the kind of tension that makes everyone eager to find reasons to leave. I continued serving dessert and coffee as if nothing had happened, playing my role as the gracious hostess while inside I felt something fundamental shift and settle into a new configuration. 32 years of marriage, and this was how my husband saw me. Not as the woman who had helped him build his business from nothing, not as the partner who had managed his books and negotiated his early contracts and created the financial foundation that allowed him to take the risks that made him successful, not even as the wife who had supported his ambitions and maintained his home and raised his children. Just the maid. The evening limped along for another hour, conversation stilted and careful, everyone trying to pretend that the moment of casual cruelty hadn't happened. When the Hendersons finally made their excuses and left, their goodbyes were polite but distinctly cool. I could tell from the way they thanked me for the meal, from the particular care Janet took to compliment my cooking and the beautiful table I'd set, that they were trying to repair some of the damage Robert had done with his thoughtless comment. After they left, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, each plate and glass feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. The words Robert had spoken echoed in my mind with the persistence of a song you can't stop humming, just the maid around here now. 32 years of marriage, and this was his honest assessment of what I contributed to our shared life, what I meant to him as a person and a partner. The words lodged in my chest like the tip of a needle, sharp and persistent and impossible to ignore. I tried to rationalize it away, to find explanations that would make it hurt less. He was nervous about the meeting, I told myself. He misspoke. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. People say thoughtless things when they're under pressure, and this was an important contract, and maybe I was being too sensitive about what was probably just an unfortunate choice of words. But I knew better. I had heard the casual dismissiveness in his voice, seen the way he'd waved his hand as if brushing away any suggestion that I might have contributed something meaningful to our shared life. There was no heat in it, no anger or malice, just the kind of automatic contempt that comes from years of taking someone for granted so completely that you forget they're a full person with their own thoughts and feelings and accomplishments. I finished the dishes in silence, wiped down the counters, put away the good china we used only for special occasions like this, occasions that were supposed to celebrate our shared success and the life we'd built together. Robert had retreated to his study with a scotch, probably already on the phone with one of his golf buddies, either celebrating what he imagined had been a successful evening or complaining about how I had embarrassed him by talking too much at dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd almost certainly lost the contract because of his own rudeness, his inability to treat his wife with basic respect in front of potential clients who clearly valued different qualities in the people they chose to work with. But somehow, in whatever story he told himself about the evening, it would be my fault. I had been too forward, too talkative, too something that had made him feel the need to put me in my place. That night, lying in bed listening to Robert snore beside me, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. If I was just the maid, then I would quit. But I wouldn't quit the way most people quit a job, with 2 weeks' notice and a polite letter of resignation and wishes for continued success. I would quit comprehensively, strategically, in a way that would make it very clear exactly what this maid had been contributing to our household and our marriage and our apparently shared financial security. The next morning, Robert left for work as usual, kissing my cheek and asking what I was making for dinner, as if the previous evening had never happened. His casual expectation that life would continue exactly as it always had, that I would absorb his cruelty and carry on with my domestic duties as if nothing had changed, was somehow more insulting than the original comment had been. I smiled and told him I hadn't decided about dinner yet, and after his truck disappeared down our street, I got dressed in my best business suit, a charcoal gray ensemble I'd bought for a property managers association meeting he didn't know I'd attended, and drove to my attorney's office. Maria Gray had been my lawyer for 15 years, handling all the property acquisitions and business transactions for my rental empire. She was sharp, experienced, and had a reputation for being particularly effective in family law matters, the kind of attorney who could navigate complex financial situations with both legal expertise and strategic thinking. When I called and asked for an emergency appointment, she cleared her afternoon schedule without asking for details. "Helen," she said when I settled into the chair across from her desk, "you look like you've got something serious on your mind." I told her everything. The dinner party, Robert's casual dismissal, the years of being taken for granted and treated like hired help in my own home. I told her about the financial independence I'd built while he thought I was volunteering at the hospital, about the properties he didn't know existed, about the business I'd created and the assets I'd accumulated and the income I'd been generating for decades without his knowledge or involvement. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her legal pad, her expression growing more interested and more predatory with each detail I shared. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled, a sharp, satisfied expression that told me she understood exactly what I was asking her to help me do. "So you want to quit being the maid," she said. "I want to quit completely," I replied. "I want out of the marriage, and I want to make sure I get exactly what I'm entitled to, which, as it turns out, is quite a bit more than Robert realizes." We spent the next 4 hours going over my financial records, the property deeds, the business incorporation papers, the bank statements and tax returns and loan documents that proved the extent of what I'd built while Robert thought I was arranging flowers and organizing charity luncheons. Margaret's smile grew wider and more satisfied with each document I produced from the briefcase I'd brought. "Helen," she said finally, spreading the papers across her conference table like a general reviewing battle plans, "your husband is about to get a very expensive education about the difference between a maid and a business partner. The plan we developed over the following days was beautifully simple and perfectly legal. Under our state's community property laws, Robert was entitled to half of everything we'd acquired during our marriage, including half of my rental properties and property management business. But he was also responsible for half of all debts and obligations, including the mortgages on properties he didn't know existed, the business loans I'd secured using our joint credit rating, and the various financial commitments that came with owning a portfolio of investment real estate. More importantly, Robert would discover that several of his most valuable business assets, including the building that housed his company offices, the equipment yard where he stored his construction machinery, and the warehouse where he kept supplies and materials for ongoing projects, were actually owned by Morrison Properties, not by Robert Garrett Construction. I had purchased them years earlier when he needed to free up capital for expansion, structuring the deals as lease-to-own arrangements that had never quite converted to outright ownership because Robert had preferred to use available cash for new equipment rather than paying down the purchase prices. He'd been paying me rent on his own business facilities for 8 years without realizing it, and those lease payments had been one of the steady income streams that allowed me to continue expanding my property portfolio. The lease agreements I drafted were entirely legal and properly executed, with Robert's signature on every page, but I'd structured them in ways that were favorable to me as the landlord and less advantageous to him as the tenant than he might have negotiated if he had been paying closer attention to the terms. But the real surprise would come when he learned about our house, the beautiful colonial that had been our home for over 2 decades. Robert Morrison had been paying rent to his wife to live in what he thought was his own property, and the lease agreement he'd signed gave me the right to terminate his tenancy with 30 days' notice for any reason or no reason at all. Margaret filed the divorce papers on a Wednesday afternoon, and Robert was served at his office the following morning. I know this because his secretary called me less than an hour later, her voice shaking with confusion and concern, to tell me that Mr. Garrett had received some legal documents and was asking her to cancel all his appointments for the rest of the day. He came home at 2 in the afternoon, his face flushed and his hands trembling slightly as he waved the papers at me. I was in the kitchen making myself a cup of tea, still wearing the apron I'd put on out of habit that morning, though I'd done no cooking or cleaning. The irony of the apron wasn't lost on me. Even in the act of destroying our marriage, I was still playing the role of the domestic servant he'd reduced me to. "What the hell is this, Helen?" he demanded, his voice cracking on my name the way it used to when we were young and he was nervous about something important. "Divorce papers. Are you out of your mind? Have you completely lost your senses?" I turned to face him, keeping my expression calm and pleasant, the same expression I'd perfected over years of absorbing his casual dismissals and thoughtless cruelties. "I'm quitting, Robert. You said I was just the maid, so I'm giving you my resignation." "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, the papers rattling in his shaking hands. "You can't be serious about this. This is insane. We can talk about whatever's bothering you. We can work it out. People don't get divorced over one stupid comment made at a dinner party." "I'm sure we can discuss terms," I said mildly, untying my apron and hanging it on its hook beside the stove. "But I won't be working as your maid anymore. You'll need to make other arrangements for that." He stared at me for a long moment as if trying to process words that didn't make sense in the language he understood. This wasn't the Helen he knew, the accommodating wife, who absorbed his thoughtlessness and carried on with her duties as if nothing had happened. This was someone else entirely, someone who spoke with quiet authority and didn't seem particularly interested in his emotional state or his preferences about how this conversation should go. "Helen, come on," he said, setting the papers on the kitchen counter and trying to take my hands, but I stepped back, crossing my arms over my chest in a gesture that felt both protective and symbolic. I didn't mean anything by what I said the other night. I was just nervous about the meeting, and I spoke without thinking. "You know I don't really think of you as the maid. That's crazy. You're my wife. You're the mother of my children." "And you revealed what you really think of me," I interrupted, my voice staying level and calm despite the fury that was building in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. "After 32 years of marriage, of partnership, of building a life together, you think I'm just the maid. Well, this maid is quitting." Robert set the papers on the kitchen counter and tried to reach for me again, but I moved away, maintaining the physical distance that somehow made it easier to maintain the emotional distance I needed to get through this conversation. Look, he said, his tone shifting to the reasonable, patronizing voice he used when he wanted to manage me like a child having a tantrum. I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. I was thoughtless, and I'm sorry. I really am. But divorce? Helen, be practical here. What would you do? Where would you live? You haven't worked in years. You don't have any marketable skills anymore. I almost laughed at that, a sound that would have been bitter and sharp if I'd let it escape. The man who'd been living off my rental income for decades was lecturing me about marketable skills. The man whose business facilities were owned by my company was telling me I had no professional capabilities. The man who had been my tenant for 22 years without knowing it was explaining to me how the world worked. I'll manage, Robert, I said quietly. I always have. With what money, Mo? He pressed, his voice taking on the kind of exasperated patience that adults use with children who don't understand obvious things. I mean, you'll get something in the settlement, of course, but be realistic. You've been out of the workforce for decades. You don't have any savings, any investments, any source of income. And this house, my business, Helen, you'd be walking away from everything we've built together. You'd be starting over with nothing at your age. That's not practical. That's not smart. There it was again, that dismissive certainty that I was helpless without him, that everything of value in our shared life was his creation, his property, his success. He genuinely believed that I had spent 32 years as a decorative accessory to his ambitions, contributing nothing but domestic labor and social pleasantries. In his mind, I was financially dependent and professionally irrelevant, a middle-aged woman with no assets and no prospects, completely reliant on his generosity and protection. You're right, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I would be walking away from everything we built together. But I think you might be surprised by exactly what that includes. Something in my tone must have warned him, because his confident expression faltered slightly, the first crack in the armor of absolute certainty he'd been wearing since he'd walked through the door with those divorce papers. What do you mean by that? I mean, you should probably call your lawyer, Robert. Today, this afternoon. And you should probably ask him to explain community property laws to you, because I don't think you understand how they work. I untied the apron I'd put back on out of nervous habit and hung it carefully on its hook beside the stove, a gesture that felt both practical and symbolic. Where are you going? He called after me as I walked toward the front door. To my office, I said over my shoulder. I have a business to run. I left him standing in the kitchen holding the divorce papers, and I could feel his confusion and growing panic following me out the door like a physical presence. For 32 years, I had been the one left standing in kitchens, holding pieces of paper that represented other people's decisions about my life, tax documents I wasn't supposed to worry my pretty head about, contracts I didn't need to understand, business decisions that were above my pay grade. It felt remarkably good to be the one walking away, the one who knew exactly what was coming next, while someone else tried to process information that didn't fit their understanding of reality. The next few weeks were a fascinating study in the psychology of discovery. Robert's lawyer, a competent but unremarkable man named Greg Walsh, who handled most of the construction industry's legal needs in our area, had initially approached the case with the casual confidence of someone who assumed this would be a straightforward divorce between a successful businessman and his unemployed wife. Simple asset division, modest alimony payments, the kind of routine dissolution that experienced family law attorneys handle without breaking a sweat. I imagine his first phone call to Robert after reviewing my financial disclosure documents was quite interesting. Margaret had insisted on being thorough, providing documentation for every property, every business account, every asset I'd acquired during our marriage. The list ran to 14 pages of single-spaced text, complete with property appraisals, business valuations, bank statements, and tax returns that painted a picture of wealth accumulation that neither Robert nor his attorney had been expecting. Robert called me 6 times that first evening after Walsh had briefed him on what he was actually facing, but I let every call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet, wasn't prepared to deal with his shock and anger and whatever combination of emotions he was working through as he tried to process the reality of who I actually was versus who he'd thought I was for the past 3 decades. His messages progressed from confused to angry to pleading and back to angry again, an emotional roller coaster that I could track through the increasing desperation in his voice. The first message was pure bewilderment. Helen, Walsh is saying things that don't make any sense. Call me back. We need to talk about this. The second was accusatory. How could you keep secrets like this? How could you lie to me for years about what you were doing? The third was bargaining. Look, whatever problems we have, we can work them out. We don't need lawyers. We can figure this out ourselves. The final message, left at nearly midnight, was just him breathing into the phone for almost a minute before hanging up, and something about that silence was more unsettling than all the words had been. It was the sound of a man trying to figure out how his entire understanding of his life had been wrong for so long, how the person he'd been married to for 32 years was apparently someone he'd never really known at all. The next morning he was waiting for me in the parking lot of my office building, something he'd never done in the 15 years I'd been working there. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled in ways that made him look older and more vulnerable than I'd seen him in years. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. When I got out of my car, he approached me with the careful movements of someone who wasn't sure what kind of reaction to expect, like he was dealing with a stranger who might be dangerous or unpredictable. In a way, I suppose he was. The Helen he'd been married to, the accommodating wife who absorbed his thoughtlessness and carried on with her domestic duties, wouldn't have filed for divorce. She wouldn't have had the resources or the resolve or the professional support system to challenge him in ways that mattered. This Helen, the one standing in front of him in a business suit with her own office and her own lawyer, was someone he didn't know how to handle. "Helen," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and whatever emotions he'd been wrestling with all night. "We need to talk." "About what, Robert?" "About all of this." He gestured vaguely at the building behind me, a converted warehouse in what had once been the industrial district and was now becoming a trendy area of galleries and lofts and small businesses. The building itself was one of my properties, something I'd bought and renovated and turned into office space for creative professionals and service businesses. "Walsh says you own 7 properties. He says you have a property management company. He says you've been running a business for 15 years. He says—" He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear away cobwebs. "Helen, how is this possible? Where did you get the money for all this?" "I earned it," I said simply. "The same way you earned the money for your business. I worked for it." "But when? How? You've been at home for years. You volunteer at the hospital. You take care of the house. You manage our social calendar. When would you have had time to build a real estate empire?" I looked at him for a long moment, this man I'd been married to for 3 decades, and realized he genuinely had no idea how I spent my days. He had created such a complete picture of me as a domestic ornament that he couldn't process evidence to the contrary, couldn't integrate new information that didn't fit his existing assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. "Robert," I said gently, my voice carrying the kind of patient explanation you might use with a child who is struggling to understand a difficult concept. "I haven't volunteered at the hospital in over 10 years. I've been running Morrison Properties. I've been buying and renovating and managing rental properties. I've been building a business, developing a client base, creating a professional reputation in the real estate industry. I've been working, Robert, full-time, for 15 years. "Morrison Properties," he repeated slowly, as if testing unfamiliar words. "You named it after me?" "I named it after myself," I corrected. "My maiden name was Morrison, remember? Helen Morrison, before I became Helen Garrett, before I became your wife." He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, his face cycling through expressions of confusion and disbelief and something that might have been recognition. I could see him working backward through years of assumptions, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he'd known about our marriage and my role in it. "But why didn't you tell me? Why keep it secret?" "I didn't keep it secret, Robert. I just didn't advertise it. You never asked what I did with my time, never showed any interest in my activities as long as dinner was on the table and your shirts were clean. You assumed I was spending my days shopping and gossiping and getting my nails done, and it was easier to let you think that than to try to convince you to take me seriously." "I would have taken you seriously," he protested, but even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. He was remembering all the times he'd dismissed my opinions about business matters, all the conversations he'd cut short with patronizing smiles, all the ways he'd made it clear that my thoughts about anything more complex than meal planning were neither wanted nor valued. "Would you?" I asked. "When I tried to discuss your Henderson's contract, you told them I was just the maid. When I used to offer suggestions about your business operations, you'd tell me not to worry my pretty head about it. When I mentioned getting a real estate license years ago, you laughed and asked why I'd want to bother with strangers' houses when I had a perfectly good home of my own to take care of. When would you have taken me seriously, Robert? When would my professional ambitions have been important enough to matter to you? He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him working through the implications of what I'd told him. His wife, whom he'd been thinking of as financially dependent and professionally irrelevant, was actually a successful businesswoman with assets he'd known nothing about. The power dynamic in their marriage, which he'd thought was weighted heavily in his favor, was actually much more complicated than he'd realized. The woman he'd been supporting in his mind had actually been supporting him in ways he'd never recognized or appreciated. "The house," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walsh says you own the house. Our house." "I do. But we bought that together. I made the down payment. I've been paying the mortgage for 22 years. You made a down payment on what you thought was a purchase," I corrected. "But you've been paying rent, Robert. For 22 years, you've been paying rent to Morrison Properties to live in that house." The color drained from his face completely, leaving him looking gray and somehow smaller than he'd been moments before. "That's impossible. I have paperwork, I have records, I know what I signed." "Check your records," I suggested calmly. "Look at the paperwork you signed 22 years ago. You'll find that you never actually purchased the house. You entered into a lease-to-own agreement that you could have converted to ownership at any time by paying the full purchase price. You chose to continue making monthly payments instead, and those payments have been rent, not mortgage payments." I could see him trying to remember signing papers more than 2 decades ago, trying to recall the details of a transaction he'd assumed he understood. I could see the moment when he realized that he'd been so focused on the monthly payment amount, could we afford it, would it fit into our budget, that he'd never carefully read what he was agreeing to pay for. "You've been charging me rent," he said slowly, his voice hollow with shock and something that might have been betrayal. "For 22 years, you've been charging me rent to live in my own house." "I've been charging you rent to live in my house," I corrected, "and I've been using that rental income along with the profits from my other properties to build a very substantial business, a business that, under community property laws, you now own half of." The irony was rich enough to taste, though I took no satisfaction in his obvious distress. For 32 years, Robert had assumed that his income was supporting both of us, that my financial security depended entirely on his success and generosity. He'd felt magnanimous allowing me to spend his money on groceries and household expenses, indulgent when he gave me a credit card for personal purchases, proud of his role as provider and protector of a wife who couldn't possibly manage on her own. But the reality was that for over 2 decades, my business had been subsidizing his lifestyle in ways he'd never recognized. The rent he paid me for the house was well below market rate. I'd set it that way intentionally, wanting our living expenses to be manageable while still generating income from the property. He'd been living in a beautiful home for far less than he could have rented a comparable property anywhere else in the area, and the difference had allowed him to invest more money in his business, take bigger risks, maintain the lifestyle that made him feel successful and important. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly accumulating wealth through strategic property investments, using my business knowledge and market instincts to build something substantial and lasting. The money he thought he was generously allowing me to spend on household expenses was actually a fraction of my own income, money I could have spent on anything I wanted without consulting him or asking his permission. "So what happens now?" he asked, and for the first time in our marriage, I heard real uncertainty in his voice. He was asking a question to which he didn't already know the answer, seeking information rather than confirmation of what he'd already decided. "Now we divide our community property," I said. "You get half of everything I've built, and I get half of everything you've built. We both start over with our fair share of what we created together." "But Helen," he said, and his voice was almost pleading now, stripped of the confidence and authority that had characterized most of our interactions for the past decade, "I can't afford to buy you out of half the rental properties. The cash flow from my business is good, but it's not that good. And if you want half of my company assets, I might have to sell equipment, lay off employees, maybe even shut down projects that are already in progress. It could destroy everything I've worked for." I looked at my husband of 32 years, this man who had casually dismissed 3 decades of partnership as hired help, and felt something that might have been pity. He was beginning to understand what I'd understood for a long time, that our marriage had been a business partnership whether he acknowledged it or not, and business partnerships that require a settling of accounts. "I don't want to destroy your business, Robert," I said, "but I do want you to understand what you're walking away from when you walk away from me. I want you to understand exactly what this maid contributed to the life you've been enjoying." That evening, Margaret called to tell me that Robert's lawyer had requested a meeting to discuss settlement terms. "He's hoping to work out something that avoids a protracted court battle," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "I think the reality of the asset division is starting to sink in for both of them." "What kind of settlement do you think he'll propose?" "Probably something that lets him keep the construction business intact in exchange for giving up his claim to your properties. He'll want to maintain his income stream and his professional identity. The problem is, he doesn't fully understand yet that you can just evict him from his office building and equipment yard if you want to. Those lease agreements you structured give you tremendous leverage over his operations." We scheduled the meeting for the following week, giving both sides time to prepare their positions and develop strategies. I spent that time doing something I hadn't done in years. I thought seriously about what I wanted my life to look like going forward, what would make me happy and fulfilled and satisfied with the choices I was making. For 32 years, I had defined myself in relation to Robert's needs and preferences. I had structured my days around his schedule, my social life around his business relationships, my personal goals around supporting his ambitions. Even building my real estate business had been something I'd done in the margins of his life, during the hours when he didn't need anything from me, in ways that wouldn't interfere with my primary role as his wife and domestic support system. But now, for the first time in decades, I had the opportunity to make choices based entirely on what I wanted, what would give me satisfaction and purpose and joy. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you could either fall or fly, but either way, you were going to leave the solid ground behind. I had more money than I'd ever told Robert, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without working if I chose not to. But I liked working, liked the intellectual challenge of evaluating properties and negotiating deals and solving the complex problems that came with managing real estate investments. I liked the independence that came with being good at something, with having knowledge and skills that other people valued and respected. What I didn't like was the secrecy, the need to hide my accomplishments because they didn't fit someone else's picture of who I was supposed to be. I didn't like coming home from successful business negotiations and pretending I'd spent the day shopping or having lunch with friends. I didn't like being introduced as just the wife when I had my own professional identity and achievements that I was proud of. I wanted to be seen for who I really was. Helen Morrison Garrett, successful businesswoman, real estate investor, someone who had built something valuable through her own intelligence and hard work and strategic thinking. The settlement meeting was held in Margaret's conference room on a gray Thursday morning in October. Robert arrived with Greg Walsh and a briefcase full of financial documents, looking like a man who had spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how his world had turned upside down so completely. He looked nervous but determined, like someone who had rehearsed his arguments and was hoping they would be enough to get him through this negotiation with his dignity and his business intact. Margaret and I sat across the polished table from them, and I felt oddly calm, centered in a way I hadn't been in years. This wasn't a negotiation where I was trying to get something I wasn't entitled to or take advantage of someone else's weakness. This was simply a matter of making sure I received what was legally mine, what I had earned through decades of work and investment and strategic planning. Walsh opened with what he clearly thought was a generous offer, the kind of settlement that would allow both parties to walk away with their pride intact. Robert would give up any claim to my rental properties and business in exchange for keeping his construction company intact, including the building and equipment yard that he still didn't fully understand were owned by me. He would pay me a lump sum of $200,000 as a settlement for my share of his business assets, and we would both walk away with what we'd brought to the marriage. Margaret let him finish his presentation, making notes on her legal pad with the kind of professional attention that suggested she was taking his proposal seriously. Then she slid a folder across the table to him, her movements deliberate and confident. "These are certified property appraisals and business valuations," she said. "I think you'll find that your offer is somewhat below what Mrs. Garrett is legally entitled to." Walsh opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. I watched Robert's face as he tried to read over his lawyer's shoulder, saw the moment when the numbers began to register, when he started to understand the true scale of what I'd built while he thought I was organizing charity luncheons and choosing paint colors for the guest bedroom. My rental properties, purchased strategically in neighborhoods that had appreciated significantly over the years, were now worth just over $3 million. Morrison Properties, with its management contracts and established client base, was valued at another $800,000. The house that Robert had been living in for 22 years, the house he'd been paying rent on without realizing it, was worth $650,000 in the current market. Robert's construction business, by contrast, was valued at $1.2 million, most of which was equipment and work trucks that depreciated rapidly. The building that housed his offices and the yard where he stored equipment were assets on his balance sheet, but they were assets he didn't actually own. He had built a successful company with impressive cash flow, but he hadn't built wealth the way I had. Under community property laws, Hugh, Margaret continued, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that made it clear she knew exactly what she was talking about. Mrs. Garrett is entitled to half of all marital assets, which would include half of your client's construction business. Your client, of course, is entitled to half of her assets as well. She slid another document across the table, this one detailing the various complications that made a simple 50-50 split more complex than Walsh had initially assumed. However, there are some issues we need to address. The building where your client's business is located and the yard where he stores equipment are owned by Morrison Properties, not by him personally. Mrs. Garrett could evict him from those premises with 30 days' notice, requiring him to relocate his entire operation. The cost of such a move, including new lease deposits, moving expenses, and business interruption, would likely exceed $200,000. Walsh was frantically making calculations on his legal pad, trying to work out the financial implications of what Margaret was describing. Robert was staring at the appraisal documents as if they were written in a foreign language, his face cycling through expressions of shock and disbelief and something that might have been panic. Additionally, Margaret continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate her mastery of the complexities involved, there are the tax implications of the asset transfer to consider. Mrs. Garrett's properties have appreciated significantly since their original purchase, which means substantial capital gains taxes will be due if they're sold to facilitate any buyout arrangement. Those tax obligations would need to be factored into any settlement calculation. She leaned back in her chair and smiled the same predatory smile I'd seen in her office weeks earlier. Given these complications, Mrs. Garrett is prepared to make a counteroffer that she believes will be advantageous to both parties. I spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun, my voice steady and calm despite the magnitude of what I was about to propose. I'll waive my claim to half of your construction business, I said to Robert. In exchange, you waive your claim to half of my properties and business. We each keep what we built independently. That's not equal, Walsh protested immediately. Her assets are worth significantly more than his. That's not equitable division of community property. But he won't have to relocate his business or find new facilities, Margaret replied smoothly. And he won't owe any portion of the substantial capital gains taxes that would be triggered by liquidating properties for a buyout. When you factor in those costs and the business disruption involved, the arrangement is quite equitable. She spread another set of documents across the table, these ones showing detailed calculations of what Robert would actually net from a traditional 50-50 split once all the costs and complications were factored in. The numbers were sobering, showing that he would end up with less money and no business if we pursued the standard community property division. Robert was quiet for a long time, staring at the papers spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I could see him working through the implications, realizing that this wasn't the straightforward negotiation he'd expected. He'd come in thinking he was dealing with a financially dependent wife who would be grateful for whatever settlement he offered. Instead, he was discovering that his wife was actually wealthier than he was and held significant leverage over his business operations. "The house," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "What about the house?" "I'll sell it to you for a fair market value," I said. $650,000. You can get a mortgage like any other home buyer or pay cash if you prefer. If you choose not to purchase it, I'll sell it on the open market and you'll need to find somewhere else to live. "I can't afford a $650,000 mortgage," Fetty said, the words coming out like a confession of failure. "Not with the payments I'm already making on business loans and equipment financing." "Then you should start looking for an apartment, McKay," I said calmly. "I hear there are some nice rental properties available in your price range. I could even help you find something suitable if you'd like. I know the market quite well." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Walsh trying various approaches to get me to accept less than I was entitled to, and Margaret calmly countering each attempt with references to property law and tax code and the practical realities of untangling a complex financial partnership. But the fundamental reality couldn't be negotiated away. I had built substantial wealth while Robert had built a business with impressive cash flow but limited assets. In the end, he accepted my offer, though I could see it cost him something to admit that his assumptions about our marriage and our respective contributions had been so completely wrong. He would keep his construction company, and I would keep my real estate empire. He would purchase the house from me at fair market value, taking out a mortgage that would strain his finances considerably, but would allow him to maintain some continuity in his living situation. And we would both walk away from 32 years of marriage with a clear understanding of what we had each contributed to our shared life. The divorce was finalized 3 months later on a cold January morning that felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another. I kept my married name for business purposes. Too many professional relationships had been built around Helen Garrett for me to change it now. But I felt like Helen Morrison again, the young woman with a business degree and big dreams who had married Robert all those years ago believing they would build something beautiful together. The day after the divorce was final, Robert moved out of the house he was now buying from me. I watched from the kitchen window as he loaded his belongings into his truck, the same window where I'd stood washing dishes the night he called me just the maid. He looked older, diminished somehow, like a man who had discovered that his understanding of the world was less accurate than he'd believed. I felt sorry for him in a way that surprised me. He'd lost a wife who had loved him enough to build a secret empire rather than argue with him about respect and recognition. He'd lost a partner who had subsidized his lifestyle and supported his ambitions without asking for credit. He'd lost the comfort of a home maintained by someone who took pride in making his life easier, the security of knowing that someone else was handling all the details that kept his personal life running smoothly. But he'd also lost the burden of supporting someone he saw as dead weight, the obligation to consider anyone else's needs when making decisions about his life and career. He was free now to pursue his vision of success without having to accommodate a spouse he'd never really seen as an equal partner. And I was free too. Free to be Helen Morrison Garrett, successful real estate investor and property manager, without having to hide my accomplishments or pretend to be less capable than I was. Free to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what someone else expected of me. I sold the colonial house to a young couple with 2 small children who were excited about the good schools and the safe neighborhood and the mature trees that would shade their summer barbecues. I used the proceeds to buy a downtown loft in the Arts District, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls and huge windows and a view of the river that changed with the seasons and the time of day. It was completely different from the suburban home I'd maintained for 32 years, modern and minimalist and entirely my own. No guest bedrooms that needed to be kept ready for visitors who rarely came. No formal dining room that was used only for special occasions. No lawn that needed to be maintained to neighborhood standards. Just clean lines and open spaces and room to breathe and think and be whoever I wanted to be. I expanded Morrison Properties, bringing on a junior partner who could handle some of the day-to-day management while I focused on acquisitions and strategic planning. I started looking at commercial properties, small office buildings, and retail spaces in developing areas where I could use my experience and market knowledge to create value for business owners who needed affordable, well-managed space. I joined the Downtown Business Association and the Real Estate Investors Club, finally using my own name and credentials instead of hiding behind volunteer work and charity committees. For the first time in decades, when people asked what I did for work, I could give them an honest answer that I was proud of. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Robert at a coffee shop downtown. He looked tired but not unhappy, and we spoke politely about practical matters, forwarding mail, coordinating with tax accountants, the kinds of conversations that divorced couples have when they're working toward a functional post-marriage relationship. "Helen," he said as we were preparing to leave, his voice carrying a sincerity I hadn't heard in years, "I owe you an apology. I never realized what you were building, what you were capable of. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I didn't see you." I looked at this man who had shared 32 years of my life, who had fathered my children, who had once been my closest friend and harshest critic. "Thank you for saying that, Robert, but you couldn't see what you didn't want to acknowledge. I don't think it was a matter of capability. I think it was a matter of what fit the story you wanted to tell about our marriage." He nodded slowly, and I could see him working through the implications of what I'd said. "You're probably right. I thought I was taking care of you, protecting you, providing for you, but you were taking care of yourself all along, weren't you?" "I was taking care of both of us," I said. "That's what partners do." We parted amicably, and I haven't seen him since, though I hear from mutual friends that his business is doing well and he's dating a woman who works in interior design. I hope he's learned to see her as a full person rather than an accessory to his success. I hope he's learned the difference between a partner and a maid. As for me, I'm no longer anyone's maid. I'm Helen Morrison Garrett, and I know exactly who that is. I've learned that there's a profound difference between being underestimated and being invisible. For 32 years, I allowed Robert to see me as invisible, to treat my contributions as so natural and expected that they didn't require acknowledgement or appreciation. I told myself that love didn't need recognition, that partnership didn't require equal billing, that being taken for granted was just the price of a stable marriage. But being underestimated, that turned out to be an advantage. While Robert was dismissing me as just the maid, I was quietly building an empire. While he was assuming I was financially dependent and professionally irrelevant, I was becoming wealthier and more successful than he ever realized. His inability to see me clearly didn't make me invisible. It made me powerful in ways he never suspected. I think about that dinner party sometimes, about the moment when Robert's casual cruelty revealed the truth of how he saw our marriage. Janet Henderson had recognized something in me that my own husband had missed, had seen evidence of capability and intelligence that Robert had trained himself to ignore. In that moment, I realized that I had been complicit in my own diminishment, accepting his limited view of who I was and what I was worth. The divorce wasn't really about punishing Robert for calling me a maid. It was about refusing to continue being one. It was about claiming my place as an equal partner in the life we'd built together. And when that wasn't possible within our marriage, claiming my independence from it. There's a satisfaction in that, a deep contentment that comes from being seen and valued for who you really are. I wake up in my downtown loft each morning and look out at the city skyline, at the buildings and businesses and lives unfolding below, and I know that I'm part of it in a way I never was when I was hiding my accomplishments in the suburbs. My children, grown now with families of their own, were initially shocked by the divorce and confused by the financial revelations. They had inherited their father's assumptions about traditional gender roles, had thought of me as the domestic support system that enabled his professional success. Learning that I had my own career, my own assets, my own independent identity was disorienting for them in ways that took months to work through. But they've adjusted, and I think they respect me more now than they did when they thought of me as just their father's wife. My daughter brings her own business questions to me, asks for advice about investments and career decisions in ways that acknowledge my expertise and experience. My son includes me in conversations about real estate and financial planning, treating me as someone whose opinions matter and whose knowledge has value. They see me as someone with expertise and experience worth consulting, not just someone who remembers their birthdays and makes their favorite cookies when they come to visit. I've also discovered the pleasure of relationships where I don't have to hide who I am or pretend to be less than I am to make someone else comfortable. I've made friends through the Business Association and Investors Club, women and men who know me as Helen the real estate professional, not Helen the contractor's wife. I've started dating again, cautiously but with genuine interest, and there's something liberating about introducing myself with my own credentials and achievements. Last month I met a man named Greg at a gallery opening, a retired engineer who spent his career designing bridge foundations and now builds furniture as a hobby. When he asked what I did for work, I told him about Morrison Properties, about the satisfaction of finding undervalued properties and transforming them into homes and businesses that serve their communities. He listened with genuine interest, asked thoughtful questions, treated my work as important and valuable. We've been to dinner several times now, and not once has he suggested that I'm too pretty to worry about business matters or that I should let him handle the check because finances are too complicated for women. He sees me as a competent adult with my own resources and opinions, and there's a comfort in that recognition that I'd forgotten was possible. I'm 64 years old now, financially secure, professionally established, and personally content in ways I never was during 32 years of marriage. I own properties in 6 different neighborhoods, employ 12 people through my property management company, and serve on the board of directors for 2 local affordable housing nonprofits. I've built something meaningful and lasting with my own hands and mind, something that reflects my values and capabilities and vision for how communities can grow and thrive. When people ask me about the divorce now, about what it was like to discover that my quiet domestic life was actually a facade hiding a much more complex financial reality, I tell them that it felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for 3 decades. It felt like permission to be myself without apology or explanation, without having to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's need to feel important. The truth is that I was never just a maid, even when Robert saw me that way, even when I sometimes saw myself that way during the darker moments of our marriage. I was always Helen Morrison, the young woman with a business degree and an eye for opportunity who had simply chosen to love someone who couldn't see her clearly. I was always capable of more than I was being asked to do, always building something even when nobody was watching, always accumulating knowledge and skills and resources that would serve me when I finally decided to step out of the shadows. The difference now is that I don't have to hide it anymore. I don't have to pretend to be less than I am to make someone else comfortable with their own limitations. I don't have to accept being dismissed as just anything, not just a wife, not just a volunteer, not just the help. I am Helen Morrison Garrett, real estate investor, business owner, independent woman who built an empire while wearing an apron. I accumulated wealth while being ignored, developed expertise while being patronized, created a professional reputation while being introduced as someone's wife. And when someone tried to reduce me to hired help, I did what any self-respecting professional would do. I quit. And then I showed them exactly what they were losing when they lost me. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be undervalued anymore, refusing to accept someone else's limited vision of what you're worth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact and your assets in your own name, leaving behind the people who never bothered to see who you really were. I sleep well in my downtown loft, surrounded by the investments I made and the business I built and the life I chose for myself. I wake up each morning knowing exactly who I am and what I'm capable of, knowing that I never have to be anyone's maid again unless I choose to be, and I choose not to be. The morning sun streams through my floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors of my loft, and I make my coffee in a kitchen that belongs entirely to me. No one will criticize how I load the dishwasher or suggest that I'm using too much cream. No one will ask what's for dinner or assume that their preferences matter more than mine. No one will dismiss my opinions or wave away my expertise or introduce me as an appendage to their identity. I have meetings today with potential investors who are interested in partnering with Morrison Properties on a mixed-use development project downtown. I have property showings scheduled for 2 new rental units that will probably be leased before the end of the week. I have a lunch meeting with the mayor's office about affordable housing initiatives, where my voice will be heard and my recommendations will be taken seriously because I've earned the right to have opinions that matter. This evening, Greg is taking me to the symphony, and afterward we'll have dinner at that new restaurant everyone's talking about, where we'll split the check because we're both adults with our own money and our own resources. We'll talk about his furniture projects and my real estate deals, about books we've read and places we'd like to travel, about the satisfaction that comes from building something beautiful and useful with your own hands. Tomorrow, I'll wake up in my own space, surrounded by art I chose and furniture that reflects my tastes, and I'll spend another day being exactly who I am without having to hide or diminish or apologize for taking up space in the world. 3 years ago, Robert called me just the maid in front of strangers, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to quit accepting a role that was too small for who I actually was, and it gave me permission to claim the life I'd been building in secret for decades. I was never just the maid. I was always Helen Morrison Garrett, successful businesswoman who happened to be very good at keeping house, and now everyone knows it, including me. That's the most important part, really. Now I know it too.